So with some of these hands-on events and comparisons that have been shown, the Switch 2 is just outright surprising many people. Some are just confused as to how certain games are even running, and even though there's been this odd conversation that's popped up around, is the Switch 2 stronger than the PlayStation 4? I think for the most part, since we haven't even had the system come out and we're in very early days of the life cycle for this new handheld from Nintendo, I mean, it's off to an impressive start. And you know what? Seeing a lot of what's happening now not only has me excited for what we could see from the tech side with Nintendo and the Switch 2 throughout this entire generation, but also from just the overall mobile chip side of things, because these chips have become quite capable in less than a decade now, and it makes me wonder what the next decade is going to look like. But we'll go over all of that here today. So if you guys enjoy this video, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if you're new. So the funniest thing about the Switch 2 is Nintendo has shown us a bunch of games on it. They've gone over specific details, but they continue to just leave out any real information about the chip that's in the system. Now, we have some idea just based on shipping data and other parts for it, the components that have gone into creating what is the T239 chip. But if you look at Nintendo's website, this is their specifications page for the Switch 2. They go over things that they really want to talk about, okay? So they'll tell you about the dimensions of it, the weight. They'll talk all about this screen, which I understand why. It is one of the, I guess, the strong points, really, of this system. And something that I think will be very interesting for the mainstream to really experience here. So capacitive touchscreen, of course, 7.9-inch wide color gamut LCD screen, 920 by 1080 pixels, HDR10 support, VRR up to 120 hertz. Now, the thing with this is, while I'm sure many of you out there have experienced, say, HDR, on like a flat screen TV or something, there are many who have not experienced VRR or variable refresh rate or 120 hertz display, or both of them in tandem, because it is very impressive to see when it's in front of you, like at full blast. You have all the benefits of variable refresh rate, and you have the higher frame rate that goes along with 120 hertz, and just how smooth the whole thing looks. Because this is something that will be just part of the Switch 2. I mean, there'll be a lot of people for the first time. Again, this is a more mainstream device, something that, I wouldn't be shocked if it did go over 100 million units. Many people will really experience all of this for the first time. I kind of look at the Switch OLED sort of the same way, as there are many people who had not experienced OLED at all until they bought the system, and then they're just sold on OLED now. Maybe the next TV they're going to get is just OLED because they saw what the Switch was able to do with that panel. And in a way, I can kind of understand why people maybe who had that are looking at the LCD screen like, oh, I got to go back to LCD? This older display. Look, trust me, VRR, 120 hertz, HDR, more pixels, I think all of that is actually worth making the jump in this case. And of course, let's be real, there'll be an OLED display probably halfway through the generation. Anyway, down from there, you can see right below it, CPU, GPU, custom processor made by NVIDIA. That's it. They didn't really get too in-depth at all. NVIDIA spent a bit more time explaining this chip, at least the capabilities, I'll say, of the chip. And this was over on actually a blog post, I believe, on their site that was just titled Switch 2 Leveled Up with NVIDIA AI-powered DLSS and 4K gaming, as there were some questions if this system had DLSS, did it have ray tracing? Well, NVIDIA spent a little bit of time just kind of going over that, mentioning the new RT cores bring real-time ray tracing, delivering lifelike lighting, reflections, and shadows for more immersive worlds. We'll have to see what game attempts it first with ray tracing. As we know, ray tracing, when you turn it on, tanks the frame rate quite a bit. So I'll be curious maybe if there's a game that goes heavily on the more visual fidelity side and just opts not to even try for 60 or even 40 frames. It's like, it's 30, and we're going to turn on all the bells and whistles and try to make this game look really good on the Switch 2. And maybe they try it out there, but otherwise, of course, Tensor Cores power AI-driven features like deep learning super sampling, DLSS, boosting resolution for sharper details without sacrificing image quality. There's been questions around if DLSS is being used in some of these games that are being shown at hands-on events. I think Hitman has been brought up as maybe a candidate for using it, but the thing is, I think a lot of the analysis right now around some of the fine details for the Switch 2 will be more relevant when people just have the system and are able to run their own analysis and stuff from footage that they're able to capture with their own tools like Digital Foundry. But Tensor Cores also enable AI-powered face tracking and background removal and video chat use cases, enhancing social gaming and streaming. So think about game chat. I mean, there you go. That's one of the main uses there, as they're mentioning here for Tensor Cores, where they'll remove your background like it's a green screen kind of effect and set that up alongside of characters in games. And obviously leaning into the more social aspect that Nintendo is trying to implement here. But otherwise, that's kind of it. They didn't say, oh yeah, here's how many CUDA cores or whatever, right? They didn't get too in depth. Here's the frequency that the CPU or the GPU or whatever is running at. Now, they did mention that for variable refresh rate via NVIDIA G-Sync in handheld mode ensures ultra-smooth, tear-free gameplay. And I really don't want to undersell variable refresh rate with NVIDIA G-Sync for something like this, because I think that can be a game changer when it comes to the handheld profile, since developers will know it's there. It's not like, oh, maybe they have a display that's G-Sync enabled and their video card's set up just right and their configuration is good to go. No, they'll just know, hey, it's there. Okay, what can we do in the handheld profile that maybe can leverage that and make the games run better? Maybe we do shoot for 40 frames per second, which divides evenly, of course, into the 120 hertz display that we have with this LCD on the Switch 2, and that with VRR would give us a very smooth looking experience. It's not quite 60 because we couldn't get the game there. It was hovering in the 40s, but we'll get it to 40 frames, and that'll be better than 30 and just look smoother across the board with VRR. Those are the kind of experiences when I hear about something like Cyberpunk that I immediately get excited for what other things we could see at a different, larger, we'll say AAA graphically intensive titles that do make the jump over to the Switch 2. We also had Eurogamer sort of trying to put all of the details around specifications that have been gathered online from places like Famaboards, where again, they were tracking shipping logs and data and inventory, trying to figure out what exactly was going back and forth between some of these manufacturers, and tracking the T239 that had updates and like Linux distros and stuff. And this is for the most part what they've come up with. 8-core processors, the ARM A78, which is funny because I remember we were talking about like a A7 series back in the day with the Switch when stuff was leaking out about it way back in the day. Could they be going for a more powerful CPU at the time? Not necessarily, but it got them through 8 years. However, this is a pretty good jump on the CPU side, going from 4 cores up to 8 cores with the A78. The clock speeds are... It's tough because this is what they believe it'll be, right around that like 1 gigahertz or so mark, although it seems to be higher in mobile versus docked, which is interesting. And then of course the GPU clocks 1 gigahertz docked, 561 megahertz mobile. However, these aren't necessarily verified just yet. And I mean, it could be off by a single megahertz and technically it's wrong, but it gives at least a ballpark estimate. The thing that I'm most happy to see here is the memory bandwidth being quadrupled just about at this point for the Switch 2, going from what was like 24 gigabytes per second or something with the Switch up to 102 gigabytes docked, which is where it will be most crucial, of course, aiming to upscale the best resolution possible to 4K, and then 68 gigabytes per second in mobile, really targeting that 1080p display at its height. Really, it could probably do like 900p or something in upscale, and most people wouldn't be able to tell necessarily the difference. So I think that's one of the biggest things we're seeing right now with the Switch 2 is just the increased memory bandwidth that should hopefully make games, for example, that stutter quite a bit or have a hard time in certain games where the frame rate is just tanking as you're going through the world. Maybe open that up a bit and all of a sudden, oh yeah, it's 60. I don't know, maybe like Breath of the Wild. Now, the conversation that's come up that is, I think, kind of funny is the question, is the Switch 2 more powerful than the PlayStation 4? You know, the system from 2013. And answer is yes. It's pretty straightforward, I think, just looking at the capabilities right now of the Switch 2 versus the PlayStation. I mean, some people will be like, oh, it's 4K versus 1080p. Of course, the Switch 2 is more powerful. But it technically goes a little deeper than that because we are seeing games that are just not even on the PS4. They weren't even attempted to be put there, and they're running on the Switch 2. All right, so one example clearly is Cyberpunk with Phantom Liberty, as the DLC was not moved to the PS4 despite a large install size. It's not like we're seeing developers and publishers opt not to move games to the PS4 because some are backporting titles there if they can make it happen, like Jedi Survivor. No, instead, CD Projekt was like, yeah, it wouldn't really work on last gen systems, so we didn't do it. Like that's it. There you go. Okay, so the Switch 2 can run something the PS4 cannot. Also, going from that, Final Fantasy VII Intergrade just looks better on the Switch 2 than, go figure, Final Fantasy VII Base, the remake, because Intergrade got all kinds of lighting enhancements and stuff. And even then, people were kind of comparing it to the PS5, and it was close. Although, I will say this, I would be a little careful with those PS5 versus Switch 2 comparisons. The PS5 is still, yes, a more powerful system, and it shows in many games where, like Cyberpunk, it's 60 frames on the PS5. There you go. And I think you're going to see that still with the Switch 2 when you get ports. You might have the frame rate cut down to 30 or maybe 40 and use that VRR display. So I don't necessarily think the PS5 versus Switch 2 comparisons will go over incredible for people out there who are like, yeah, the Switch 2 is going to stand right next to the PS5. But it doesn't necessarily have to, because I do think there is that sense of, and clearly we saw it during the Switch generation, good enough, especially for the mainstream. There are a lot of sacrifices for some of those Switch games. Witcher 3, really cool that it was there. Hard to believe that it was possible, but you play it, and then you look at pretty much any other platform, and you're like, wow, they did cut down a lot to make this happen. Hogwarts Legacy was another one where they had to add in full load screens going into like major parts of the game. You see those kind of cutbacks, but people still opted to buy these games because of the convenience. And there's that sense of, is it good enough for what I want? And the fact that it does fit in a bit better maybe to my lifestyle and when I can play games. And the answer most of the time for a lot of people is just yes. Like, that's why they bought the Switch. So I think now more than ever, looking at this and seeing, okay, now it's a 4K system. Okay, now in handheld mode, it's 1080p, and it doesn't look like there's as many cutbacks, say, as the Switch. Has it reached that good enough status for people, even with some of these cutbacks? And I think the answer is just yes again. And it becomes easier and easier to make that decision when you see that the system is punching above its weight class. And I think we're going to see that heavily with the Switch too. Street Fighter 6, people were putting up comparisons for that. It was just shocking people, it seemed, that it was right there at times with the PS5. But just the showing that the Switch 2 is having at some of these different games, and the fact that when you're playing it, especially Street Fighter 6, it's more about, I'd say, the frame rate than the visual fidelity, and the Switch 2 is just kind of holding its own there the entire way, and at times beating out some of the competition. It does make you wonder, if this is what we're seeing now, what are we going to see in 3 or 4 years as developers learn the ins and the outs of the system, what they can get away with? Because I already see the comparisons with the Steam Deck. Okay, handheld mode. I would say the Switch 2 is more comparable to a PS4. All right, so we have the PS4 1080p, the Switch 2 1080p in handheld mode. But again, you see just a much newer architecture in Ampere and all the different features that NVIDIA's packed into that. And you could see ray tracing in handheld mode, which would be interesting to see, again, someone attempt that. But these are just different things that the PS4 technically can't do. However, the Switch 2 is on a power limit in handheld mode, and that, I think, will be something that will get noticed, as we go through and things have to be cut back on. And the Steam Deck technically doesn't have the same power limitations in handheld mode, where it can run at twice the wattage. And that's why it'll be such an interesting comparison, yes, between the Steam Deck and the Switch 2, because you will see what happens when you can have one system attempting to brute force the game, and the other one being a bit more calculated, a bit more finesse about it, where a developer is targeting specific hardware with the Switch 2, turning on certain things, turning off certain things to meet a frame rate quota, if you will, and maybe turn in a better experience than a system that is pulling twice the power in handheld mode. It's going to be something to see, and it's actually pretty exciting. I'm actually more excited for this generation with the Switch 2, with this newer chip, this customized chip from NVIDIA, rather than the off-the-shelf X1 that we had with the current Switch. Yeah, it was cool when Doom and Wolfenstein 2 showed up, because it was like, whoa, this game can run on the thing. But we already knew the limitations and the drawbacks, say, for the X1 versus this chip, where even seeing Star Wars Outlaws running when it shouldn't be because it can't really run on the Steam Deck does make you go, I wonder what else this chip could do. Maybe GTA 6 isn't that far off from what we thought here with this device, especially if it is around or even better than the Xbox Series S in some cases. I mean, who's to say GTA 6 doesn't show up eventually? Doesn't seem like it's going to show up, I would assume, this year when it releases. maybe a year or two in the future. Hey, you never know. But let me know what you guys think about this one down below. Is the Switch 2 so far from what we've seen more powerful than you were expecting? And what would you like to see from a third-party perspective ported over to a system that I think is going to continue punching well above its weight class throughout the next 6, 7, even 8 years? Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.